From humble peasant to dragon throne, the Ming dynasty tells an epic tale of reinvention. After overthrowing Mongol rulers, Yuanzhang, once a starving beggar, forged an empire that would dominate East Asia for 276 years. Under brilliant emperors, China dispatched treasure fleets across distant seas, built the Forbidden City, and perfected blue-white porcelain coveted worldwide. Yet seeds of collapse were sown through factional struggles, corrupt eunuchs, and emperors who abandoned governance. As climate cooled, silver dwindled, and peasants starved, rebels and Manchu invaders converged on a broken empire. Witness the spectacular rise and tragic fall of China's last native dynasty. By the mid-14th century AD, the Yuan dynasty was collapsing under the weight of its own failures. Mongol rulers had drained China through reckless taxation, corrupt administration, and endless wars. Floods from the Yellow River destroyed farmland, famine killed millions, and plague spread unchecked through towns and villages. Local officials enriched themselves while peasants starved. What had once been the empire of Kublai Khan was now a state unable to feed its people or defend its borders. Discontent exploded into rebellion. Secret religious sects preached salvation, promising that foreign rulers would soon be swept away. The most powerful of these movements, the Red Turbans, raised armies across the provinces. Villages joined them out of desperation, convinced that the Yuan court had forfeited its right to rule. Out of this chaos rose a man who had known poverty more deeply than most, Yuanzhang. Born in 1328 in a poor village of Anhui province, he began life with no power, no wealth, and little expectation beyond survival. His parents struggled to feed their children, and when famine struck, their household crumbled. By the time he was 16, both parents were dead, leaving him without land or protection. Seeking refuge, the boy entered a Buddhist monastery, where food and shelter depended on service to the temple. Even this fragile stability did not last. When disaster deepened and resources ran out, monks expelled novices they could not support. Forced back onto the road, he begged for food, living among the mass of displaced peasants created by famine and war. This early hardship left a permanent mark. Unlike aristocrats or Mongol generals, he understood the desperation of ordinary farmers because he had lived it. When he later commanded armies, this memory shaped the discipline he demanded and the vision he held for rebuilding society. His rise was not the product of privilege, but of resilience. In 1352, he joined the Red Turban rebels. At first, he was another starving recruit, but his intelligence, literacy, and commanding presence set him apart. Leaders noticed his potential, and his steady discipline earned the loyalty of fellow fighters. Within a short time, he had risen from foot soldier to officer. Unlike other rebel commanders who indulged in plunder, he restrained his troops. Villages under his protection supplied food willingly, preferring the order he enforced to the chaos of rival bands. Success attracted allies. A crucial moment came when he married the daughter of Guo Zixing, a senior rebel leader. This alliance gave him legitimacy and placed him within the upper circle of the rebellion. Yet Guo soon died, and many assumed the movement would fracture. Instead, Zhu consolidated power, winning over Guo's followers through a mixture of generosity and discipline. He showed that he could command not only soldiers, but loyalty. Still, the Red Turbans were far from united. Leaders pursued personal ambitions, carving territories and clashing as often with one another as with the Mongols. Many alienated local populations by looting or excessive taxation. Zhu distinguished himself by treating scholars with respect. recruiting advisors who could manage administration and diplomacy. Among them was Liu Bowen, a strategist whose counsel would prove invaluable in the years ahead. With their guidance, he began transforming a rebel army into the nucleus of a government. By the late 1350s, his forces controlled key areas of the Yangtze River Valley, a region rich in resources. From these strongholds, he could feed his troops and maintain supply lines, while rivals weakened themselves through reckless campaigns. He established Nanjing as his base, fortifying it as both a military center and an administrative capital in waiting. The city became the heart of his growing domain. The Mongol regime, meanwhile, grew ever weaker. Court factions in Dadu, modern Beijing, fought over authority, and emperors were reduced to figureheads. Heavy levies alienated even Mongol supporters, while the central government failed to suppress the swelling rebellions. Each year, territory slipped further from Yuan hands. As their control collapsed, Zhu's authority expanded. In 1363, his most dangerous rival emerged, Chen Yuliang, leader of a powerful rebel force controlling central China. Their confrontation culminated at Lake Poyang, one of the largest naval battles in history. For weeks, fleets clashed across the waters. Chen's ships were massive, but Zhu's commanders used fire attacks and superior coordination to turn the tide. Victory secured his dominance in the south, eliminating the most serious challenge to his leadership. After Poyang, his path to supremacy was clear. Other rebels either submitted or were defeated in turn. He adopted the title Prince of Wu, signaling his ambition to claim more than regional control. His administration strengthened, combining military power with civilian governance. Land reforms rewarded loyal followers, while grain storage projects reassured the population that stability was returning. By 1368, the Yuan dynasty had lost all credibility. When Zhu marched north with his armies, resistance crumbled. His troops advanced toward Dadu, and the last Yuan emperor fled beyond the Great Wall, retreating to the Mongol homeland. At the age of 40, the former beggar proclaimed the founding of a new dynasty, the Ming. He chose the reign title Hongwu, meaning vastly martial, a declaration that the era of Mongol domination had ended. The rise of this dynasty was more than a transfer of power. It represented the return of native rule after nearly a century of foreign domination. For millions who had suffered famine, war, and plague, the new order carried the promise of stability. The man who had once begged for scraps outside monastery walls now sat upon the dragon throne, his journey symbolizing resilience in the face of catastrophe. His rise also set the tone for the dynasty to come. Harsh lessons of poverty shaped his distrust of elites, his suspicion of corruption, and his insistence on discipline. The Ming state would bear the imprint of its founder for generations, molded by the experiences of a man who had lived the hardships of the people he now ruled. From the ruins of the Yuan, Yuanzhang had forged a new beginning. The dynasty he established in 1368 would last nearly 3 centuries, guiding China through eras of expansion, prosperity, crisis, and ultimately collapse. But its foundation lay in this moment, when a peasant orphan, hardened by famine and rebellion, rose to overthrow the Mongol Empire and claim the mandate of heaven for himself. When Yuanzhang declared himself emperor in 1368, the proclamation was only the beginning. Winning power had required fire, cunning, and resilience. Holding it would demand even more. The orphan who became Hongwu now faced the challenge of transforming a fractured land into a functioning state. What followed was one of the most forceful reigns in Chinese history, marked by centralization, reform, and suspicion that bordered on paranoia. The new dynasty took Nanjing as its capital. Strategically placed along the Yangtze River, the city had been Zhu's stronghold during the final campaigns against rival rebels. Now it became the seat of imperial authority. Palaces rose, government offices were organized, and rituals declared the return of legitimate rule. Choosing Nanjing rather than Dadu, the abandoned Yuan capital, symbolized a clean break with the Mongols. It was a deliberate statement. The Ming dynasty would not simply inherit Yuan institutions. It would rebuild China on native foundations. From the outset, the ruler concentrated power in his own hands. During the final years of war, he had learned how rival commanders or ambitious ministers could destabilize authority. Determined to prevent challenges, he abolished the office of chancellor, a position that had traditionally balanced imperial power by directing the civil bureaucracy. By removing it, he ensured that all memorials, decrees, and decisions flowed directly to him. Ministers were reduced to servants, their influence controlled by fear of imperial wrath. This concentration of authority made the sovereign both indispensable and terrifying. Law and order became the cornerstone of his reign. In 1385, the Great Ming Code was promulgated. Far more than a legal manual, it was a blueprint for social order, regulating not only crimes, but daily conduct. It dictated obligations between ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife. Penalties were severe, often brutal, reflecting both the harshness of the age and the ruler's determination to impose stability. For Hongwu, law was not a neutral system. It was an instrument to reshape society in the image of his will. Agriculture received particular attention. The devastation of decades of war and natural disaster had left millions displaced, fields abandoned and granaries empty. The emperor understood hunger from personal experience, and restoring the countryside became his highest priority. He ordered the distribution of land to peasant families, encouraged migration to underpopulated regions, and invested in canals and irrigation projects. Tax burdens were carefully calculated to avoid crushing smallholders, while communal granaries stored surplus grain for emergencies. These measures slowly rebuilt food security, allowing rural communities to recover. Yet the same ruler who valued peasants distrusted scholars. Many officials who had once served the Yuan were now eager to ingratiate themselves with the new dynasty. Hongwu welcomed their expertise, but feared their loyalty. He viewed the scholar-bureaucrat class with suspicion, seeing in their polished rhetoric a potential threat to imperial authority. When he suspected disloyalty, his response was merciless. Purges swept through the bureaucracy in repeated waves, eliminating officials accused of corruption, conspiracy, or even insufficient obedience. Tens of thousands were executed, creating a climate where silence often seemed safer than advice. Despite this climate of fear, the bureaucracy functioned. Examinations resumed, based firmly on Confucian classics, reaffirming the link between education and service. Scholars continued to compete for appointments, even under the shadow of purges, because imperial favor brought immense rewards. This balance of opportunity and terror kept the system both productive and compliant. The army remained a central concern. Memories of Mongol raids had not faded, and the emperor knew that victory in 1368 did not guarantee permanent security. He organized frontier garrisons along the northern borders, resettling soldiers with their families in military colonies. These units combined defense with agriculture, ensuring they could support themselves while guarding against steppe incursions. The strategy reflected his desire to minimize dependence on mercenary commanders. Troops were to be tied to the land, loyal to the dynasty, and sustained without burdening the treasury. Campaigns against remaining Mongol forces were launched repeatedly in the 1370s and 1380s. Generals advanced into the steppes, burning camps and dispersing tribes that threatened Chinese borders. None of these expeditions produced permanent conquest, but they secured the frontier long enough for the dynasty to consolidate internally. Each victory reinforced the image of the new order as the defender of China against foreign domination. At the same time, internal security was relentlessly enforced. The emperor created secret police organs to monitor officials and commoners alike. The embroidered uniform guard became infamous for arrests, interrogations, and executions carried out in the name of loyalty. Fear of surveillance penetrated court and countryside alike. Loyalty was demanded not only in action, but in thought, with any criticism treated as betrayal. Family values were elevated to political doctrine. The Hongwu emperor saw the family as the foundation of society and sought to extend that model to governance. Sons owed absolute obedience to fathers, just as subjects owed it to the throne. Filial piety became more than a moral teaching. It was written into law, reinforced by punishments for disobedience. The emperor's own sprawling family of princes and descendants was placed in charge of territories across the realm. Their positions meant to secure loyalty, but also creating seeds of future conflict. Despite his harshness, his reign delivered stability. Fields were cultivated, granaries filled, and borders defended. Trade revived along internal routes, and artisans returned to their crafts. The population, exhausted by decades of chaos, accepted the discipline of the new regime in exchange for peace. For many, the stern ruler was preferable to the disasters of Mongol neglect and rebel banditry. Still, the ruler's legacy was not purely positive. The atmosphere of fear he cultivated created a bureaucracy that often hesitated to act without explicit orders. Innovation was discouraged, and initiative punished if results displeased the throne. His suspicion of intellectuals cast a long shadow, creating tension between emperor and scholar officials that would haunt the dynasty for centuries. When he died in 1398, he left behind more than an empire. He left a system shaped by his experiences, centralized, disciplined, and unyielding. Nanjing stood as the capital of a restored Chinese dynasty, its institutions marked by both stability and paranoia. The founder's harsh but effective measures had carried the Ming from fragile beginnings to powerful order. But succession would not proceed smoothly. The passing of the founder opened a struggle that would determine whether his vision endured or fractured. His chosen heir, the Jianwen emperor, soon found himself in conflict with powerful princes, including the formidable Prince of Yuan. The dynasty that had risen from rebellion was about to be tested by civil war. The death of the Hongwu emperor in 1398 ended an age of absolute authority. For 3 decades, he had ruled with a grip so firm that even whispers of dissent could cost lives. His death left behind not only a powerful dynasty, but also a problem: how to transfer control without unleashing the rivalries he had barely contained. His grandson, Yuanwen, just 21 years old, became heir. Known to history as the Jianwen emperor, the young sovereign seemed a symbol of change. Courtiers praised his intelligence, his Confucian education, and his gentler temperament. Many officials believed he would temper the harshness of his grandfather and build a government that valued scholars over spies, persuasion over fear. Yet youth also meant vulnerability. Arrayed against him were powerful uncles, sons of the founder, each commanding their own military estates and personal armies. Hongwu had scattered his princes across the empire to secure loyalty and defend frontiers. In practice, this created warlords in imperial robes. They were brothers to the late ruler, men hardened by campaigns, each entrenched in regions where their word carried the force of law. Among them, none was more formidable than Zhu Di, the Prince of Yuan, who held Beijing as his stronghold and commanded the northern armies guarding against Mongol incursions. The new emperor's court understood the danger. Advisors urged him to weaken the princes before they grew too strong. The sovereign moved quickly, issuing decrees that stripped several uncles of troops, curtailed estates, and curtailed privileges. He framed these actions as necessary reforms, meant to protect the dynasty from abuse. But everyone understood the deeper reality. The throne feared its own bloodline. At first, these measures seemed effective. Lesser princes were reduced, their households broken apart, their power eroded. Yet each blow created resentment. Those spared watched uneasily, knowing their turn could come. None felt this pressure more keenly than the Prince of Yan. With his capital in Beijing and armies hardened by frontier battles, he commanded not only soldiers, but loyalty born of shared hardship. For him, disarmament meant more than loss of privilege. It meant exposure to enemies at court who wished him eliminated. The Jianwen emperor trusted his circle of scholar officials. Men like Qi Tai and Huang urged boldness. They advised that the throne must confront Zhu Di directly, cutting down the most dangerous uncle before he struck first. The young ruler hesitated, but the policy was set. The Prince of Yan would be targeted. Zhu Di understood the stakes. Outwardly, he feigned illness and humility, sending memorials that portrayed him as a loyal son of the dynasty. In secret, he prepared. His troops drilled, his officers pledged loyalty, and his spies reported every movement in Nanjing. When imperial envoys attempted to restrict his command, he struck. In 1399, he declared that corrupt advisors had misled the emperor and that he was acting to cleanse the court. Cloaking rebellion as loyalty, he raised his banners and began his march south. The conflict that followed, the Jingnan Rebellion, plunged the dynasty into civil war. Both sides invoked legitimacy, Jianwen as rightful sovereign, Zhu Di as loyal prince defending the dynasty's purity. For 3 years, armies clashed along rivers and plains, cities changed hands, and the balance of power shifted back and forth. In the first campaigns, the imperial court enjoyed early successes. Loyalist generals scored victories, and at one point, the Prince of Yan narrowly escaped capture. Reports to Nanjing promised swift victory. The young ruler was jubilant, convinced that heaven had blessed his cause. Yet overconfidence soon proved costly. Zhu Di adapted. He employed deception, feigned retreats, and struck where the enemy least expected. His forces, hardened by years on the northern frontier, fought with discipline absent among many imperial troops. Morale on the rebel side remained high, driven by loyalty to their commander and the promise of reward if he triumphed. The court in Nanjing faltered under pressure. Jianwen relied on scholars for strategy, but they lacked military experience. Orders were sometimes contradictory, and rival commanders quarreled over precedence. The memory of Hongwu's purges still haunted officers, making them cautious to act without explicit approval. In contrast, Zhu Di commanded directly, inspiring confidence by sharing hardship with his soldiers. As the war dragged on, defections weakened the imperial side. Some generals calculated that the usurper's chances of victory were rising and switched allegiance. Others, resentful of harsh discipline or fearful of defeat, abandoned their posts. Each defection further eroded the emperor's position. Major battles shifted the momentum. At Baigu River, Zhu Di routed loyalist forces through surprise maneuvers, seizing weapons and supplies. At Dongchang, his army again prevailed, demonstrating tactical flexibility. These victories boosted his reputation and sowed panic in Nanjing. By 1402, rebel forces were advancing steadily down the Yangtze. The walls of Nanjing prepared for siege, but morale was collapsing. Inside the palace, debate turned frantic. Some urged negotiation, others called for desperate defense. The emperor remained resolute but isolated. His closest advisors urged resistance to the last, yet even they doubted survival. When Zhu Di's army stormed Nanjing, the city descended into chaos. Fire consumed sections of the palace. Chroniclers disagree on what happened next. One version claims the young ruler perished in the flames, refusing capture. Another whispers that he escaped in disguise, wandering as a monk in obscurity. Rumors of his survival circulated for decades, fueling legends of the hidden emperor. But in official history, his reign ended abruptly, consumed by fire and defeat. With Nanjing secured, Zhu Di claimed the throne. He proclaimed himself emperor, adopting the reign title Yongle, perpetual happiness. His entry into power was framed as the restoration of stability after corrupt ministers had misled his nephew. Yet everyone knew the truth. It was the triumph of a usurper who had transformed rebellion into legitimacy. The consequences were immense. Families had been divided by loyalty, provinces scarred by conflict, and the dynasty's aura of invincibility cracked. Yet the new ruler wasted no time. He purged officials loyal to Jianwen, restructured government, and prepared to shift the empire's center northward. Ambition marked his every move. From this bloody victory would emerge one of the most energetic reigns in Chinese history. The civil war that had begun as a struggle between uncle and nephew ended with the capital in ruins and the dynasty in new hands. The Jianwen emperor vanished into uncertainty, remembered as a brief interlude of reform cut short. The Yongle emperor stood triumphant, ready to move the capital to Beijing, to build monuments of stone and marble, and to send Chinese fleets into waters no dynasty had ever dared to command. Victory in the Jingnan. Rebellion gave Zhu Di the throne, but legitimacy did not arrive with it. In 1402, he entered Nanjing as a conqueror, not as an undisputed heir. To secure his reign, he needed more than military success. He needed to convince officials, subjects, and foreign envoys that the mandate of heaven now rested with him. Known as the Yongle Emperor, he set out to transform a usurpation into one of the most dynamic reigns in Chinese history. His first steps were decisive. Nanjing, though a stronghold during his rise, no longer suited his vision. It lay deep in the south, vulnerable to uprisings and distant from the Mongol frontier. For a ruler forged on the northern plains, the true seat of power had to be closer to the Great Wall. He ordered the transfer of government to Beijing, then little more than a garrison city. This decision reshaped China's political geography for centuries to come. Construction began on a scale that dwarfed anything attempted before. Hundreds of thousands of laborers were mobilized, drawn from provinces across the realm. Timber was hauled from Yunnan's distant forests, stones quarried and floated along canals, bricks fired in furnaces that burned day and night. The plan was to create not just a palace, but a city within a city. the Forbidden City. Its concentric walls, golden roofs, and vast courtyards placed the ruler at the center of a cosmic order, accessible only through layers of gates that reinforced hierarchy. When completed, the complex proclaimed that Yongle's reign was not provisional, but eternal, rooted in marble and brick. Architecture alone could not secure authority. The emperor understood the need for intellectual legitimacy. His father had ruled through fear and purges, but Yongle sought to display patronage of culture. He restored the civil examinations, bringing scholars back into service, and surrounded himself with advisors capable of articulating his vision in Confucian terms. The greatest symbol of this revival was the Yongle Encyclopedia. Compiled by thousands of scholars, it sought to gather all human knowledge, classics, histories, science, medicine, geography, into a single work. Though few copies survived, its creation reflected an emperor determined to inscribe his reign into the permanent record of civilization. But Yongle was not content with books and buildings. His reign was marked by movement, conquest, and outward expansion. To the north, Mongol power still loomed. Steppe confederations might have fragmented since the days of Kublai, but their cavalry remained formidable, and memories of Yuan domination were fresh. The emperor personally led campaigns beyond the Great Wall, riding with his armies into the grasslands. His expeditions reached as far as the Gobi Desert, burning camps, scattering tribes, and demonstrating that the Ming dynasty was not confined behind walls. Though no permanent conquest resulted, these campaigns reaffirmed China's dominance and reminded both subjects and enemies that the sovereign himself was still a warrior. Even more extraordinary were his ventures across the seas. Beginning in 1405, he ordered a series of maritime expeditions under the command of Zheng He, a trusted eunuch admiral. The fleets were astonishing in size, treasure ships taller than city walls, accompanied by hundreds of smaller vessels carrying soldiers, translators, craftsmen, and envoys. Their sails shadowed the horizon as they moved through the South China Sea, into the Indian Ocean, and as far as the coast of Africa. These voyages transformed Ming influence. In Southeast Asia, kingdoms offered tribute to avoid the wrath of the mighty fleets. In India, envoys exchanged gifts and negotiated trade. On the shores of Arabia and East Africa, rulers marveled at ships larger than anything they had ever seen. Exotic animals, giraffes, zebras, ostriches, were brought back to Beijing, astonishing the court and fueling the belief that the dynasty enjoyed heaven's favor. The expeditions carried porcelain, silk, and silver outward, and returned with spices, gems, and tribute that reinforced the empire's wealth. The missions also carried political weight. One voyage captured a pretender in Sri Lanka and brought him in chains before the emperor. Others installed friendly rulers or mediated disputes between foreign states. These actions projected Chinese authority as far away as the Red Sea. While the voyages were costly, they demonstrated that the Ming dynasty was not merely regional, but global in reach. At home, Yongle expanded the tribute system. Envoys from Korea, Japan, Vietnam, Central Asia, and beyond arrived at Beijing to present gifts and perform the ritual of submission. In return, they received lavish exchanges, titles, and the prestige of Ming recognition. The system reinforced the emperor's role as the axis of the known world, with tributary states revolving around his throne like stars around the pole. But ambition carried costs. The construction of Beijing drained labor and treasure. The northern campaigns required immense logistical support. The voyages consumed resources on a scale few dynasties could sustain. Peasants bore heavier tax burdens, And while prosperity continued in many regions, murmurs of strain began to surface. Critics within the bureaucracy argued that the empire should conserve its wealth rather than pour it into distant expeditions. Yet Yongle tolerated no open opposition. His reliance on eunuchs to manage projects created friction with scholar officials, tensions that would outlast his reign. Still, the results were undeniable. Under Yongle, China stood at the peak of power and prestige. The Forbidden City embodied imperial grandeur. The encyclopedia proclaimed cultural supremacy. Armies marched north with confidence, while fleets sailed farther than any before. He was not merely a usurper who had seized a throne. He was a monarch who reshaped the empire into a new form. In 1424, while leading yet another campaign against the Mongols, the emperor died on the northern frontier. His body was returned to Beijing, buried in the imperial tombs north of the capital. He left behind a dynasty more ambitious than when he had taken it, but also more burdened by costs and strained by rivalries between eunuchs and officials. The throne passed to his son, the Xuande emperor. Unlike his father, Xuande would not seek glory in endless campaigns or distant oceans. Instead, he would attempt to consolidate and stabilize what his father had built, an empire grand in ambition but in need of balance. When Zhuangzi assumed the throne in 1425, he was no stranger to power. As heir, he had already managed government affairs during his father's campaigns, earning the respect of ministers and generals alike. Now known as the Xuande Emperor, he brought to the throne a reputation for moderation, competence, and balance. After decades defined by the relentless drive of his father, this new sovereign offered something different: stability. His reign opened not with grand conquests, but with careful adjustments. The empire had been stretched by Yongle's projects, massive construction in Beijing, repeated campaigns against the Mongols, and the costly fleets that sailed to Africa and back. Xuande recognized the achievements, but also the strains. His priority became consolidation, maintaining strength without exhausting the treasury, projecting authority without draining the people. One of his first acts was to restore confidence in government. Where Yongle had often relied on eunuchs to bypass officials, Xuande has sought a better balance. He reduced the influence of palace functionaries in state affairs and reaffirmed the authority of the civil service. Scholar officials, long resentful of eunuch dominance, welcomed the change. The examinations continued to provide new talent, and the court regained some of the stability lost during the previous reign. Yet he did not abandon eunuchs entirely. Some, such as the trusted Admiral Zheng He, continued to serve in prominent roles. Xuande understood the value of capable men, regardless of origin. But he also recognized the need to prevent any group from overwhelming the machinery of state. His moderation earned him praise as a ruler who balanced competing forces rather than inflaming rivalries. Northern defense remained a constant concern. Mongol confederations had fragmented, but raids across the frontier persisted. The emperor ordered fortifications strengthened and garrisons supplied, ensuring that the Great Wall and its outposts remained effective deterrents. On several occasions, he personally directed campaigns against raiders, combining diplomacy with force. He preferred negotiation when possible, offering trade and titles to divide tribal alliances. But he did not hesitate to unleash armies when threats grew serious. His reign maintained a tense but managed frontier. One of the most symbolic episodes of his rule was the final voyage of Zheng He. In 1431, the great admiral embarked once more from Nanjing, leading a fleet across the Indian Ocean. The ships visited ports in Southeast Asia, India, and Arabia, reaffirming ties established during earlier expeditions. The voyage demonstrated that the Ming dynasty still commanded respect abroad, but it was also a farewell. When Zheng died during the return journey in 1433, the era of massive state-sponsored maritime expeditions ended with him. The court, increasingly focused on domestic concerns and wary of expense, allowed the fleet system to fade. Economically, Xuande's policies encouraged recovery. Taxes were enforced with consistency, but not crushing severity. Agricultural production increased as stability returned to the countryside. Canals were repaired, improving grain transport from the south to the capital. Artisans flourished, producing goods that became synonymous with Ming refinement. Blue and white porcelain reached new heights of craftsmanship, admired in both domestic and foreign markets. Painters at court produced masterpieces that blended boldness with subtle detail, capturing both imperial power and private reflection. Literature thrived, with scholars compiling histories and producing works that enriched the cultural heritage of the dynasty. The court, during Xuande's decade on the throne, became renowned for its elegance. Foreign envoys arriving in Beijing described ceremonies conducted with precise ritual, an emperor who presided with dignity rather than intimidation, and an atmosphere more orderly than under the tempestuous Yongle. Tribute missions continued, ensuring that the Ming court remained the recognized center of regional diplomacy. Even so, challenges persisted. The Mongols remained a threat, requiring constant vigilance. Internal corruption did not disappear, though Xuande's discipline limited its worst excesses. The costs of the previous reign still weighed on the treasury, and the memory of vast expeditions haunted debates about policy. Officials argued over whether to embrace outward ambition or retrench to conserve strength. Xuande leaned toward restraint, a choice that preserved peace but also signaled a more defensive posture compared to his father. When the emperor died in 1435, at the age of 36, his reign was remembered as a rare moment of balance in a dynasty often pulled between extremes. He had maintained northern defenses without reckless overreach, encouraged culture without neglecting administration, and kept both eunuchs and scholars within limits that prevented domination. His decade on the throne left the empire stable, prosperous, and respected. But succession again tested the dynasty. His son, the Zhengtong emperor, was only 8 years old when he inherited the throne. A child sovereign meant regency, court intrigue, and the growing influence of eunuchs eager to shape policy. The stability of Xuande's rule would soon be tested by disaster on the steppe, when overconfidence and poor counsel led to one of the greatest humiliations in Ming history, the Tumu incident. When Zhujiangji assumed the throne in 1425, he was no stranger to power. As heir, he had already managed government affairs during his father's campaigns, earning the respect of ministers and generals alike. Now known as the Xuande Emperor, he brought to the throne a reputation for moderation, competence, and balance. After decades defined by the relentless drive of his father, this new sovereign offered something different: stability. His reign opened not with grand conquests, but with careful adjustments. The empire had been stretched by Yongle's projects, massive construction in Beijing, repeated campaigns against the Mongols, and the costly fleets that sailed to Africa and back. Xuande recognized the achievements, but also the strains. His priority became consolidation, maintaining strength without exhausting the treasury, projecting authority without draining the people. One of his first acts was to restore confidence in government. Where Yongle had often relied on eunuchs to bypass officials, Xuande has sought a better balance. He reduced the influence of palace functionaries in state affairs and reaffirmed the authority of the civil service. Scholar officials, long resentful of eunuch dominance, welcomed the change. The examinations continued to provide new talent, and the court regained some of the stability lost during the previous reign. Yet he did not abandon eunuchs entirely. Some, such as the trusted Admiral Zheng He, continued to serve in prominent roles. Xuande understood the value of capable men, regardless of origin, but he also recognized the need to prevent any group from overwhelming the machinery of state. His moderation earned him praise as a ruler who balanced competing forces rather than inflaming rivalries. Northern defense remained a constant concern. Mongol confederations had fragmented, but raids across the frontier persisted. The emperor ordered fortifications strengthened and garrisons supplied, ensuring that the Great Wall and its outposts remained effective deterrents. On several occasions, he personally directed campaigns against raiders, combining diplomacy with force. He preferred negotiation when possible, offering trade and titles to divide tribal alliances. But he did not hesitate to unleash armies when threats grew serious. His reign maintained a tense but managed frontier. One of the most symbolic episodes of his rule was the final voyage of Zheng He. In 1431, the great admiral embarked once more from Nanjing, leading a fleet across the Indian Ocean. The ships visited ports in Southeast Asia, India, and Arabia, reaffirming ties established during earlier expeditions. The voyage demonstrated that the Ming dynasty still commanded respect abroad, but it was also a farewell. When Zheng He died during the return journey in 1433, the era of massive state-sponsored maritime expeditions ended with him. The court, increasingly focused on domestic concerns and wary of expense, allowed the fleet system to fade. Economically, Xuande's policies encouraged recovery. Taxes were enforced with consistency, but not crushing severity. Agricultural production increased as stability returned to the countryside. Canals were repaired, improving grain transport from the south to the capital. Artisans flourished, producing goods that became synonymous with Ming refinement. Blue and white porcelain reached new heights of craftsmanship, admired in both domestic and foreign markets. Painters at court produced masterpieces that blended boldness with subtle detail, capturing both imperial power and private reflection. Literature thrived, with scholars compiling histories and producing works that enriched the cultural heritage of the dynasty. The court during Xuande's decade on the throne became renowned for its elegance. Foreign envoys arriving in Beijing described ceremonies conducted with precise ritual, an emperor who presided with dignity rather than intimidation, and an atmosphere more orderly than under the tempestuous Yongle. Tribute missions continued, ensuring that the Ming court remained the recognized center of regional diplomacy. Even so, challenges persisted. The Mongols remained a threat, requiring constant vigilance. Internal corruption did not disappear, though Xuande's discipline limited its worst excesses. The costs of the previous reign still weighed on the treasury, and the memory of vast expeditions haunted debates about policy. Officials argued over whether to embrace outward ambition or retrench to conserve strength. Xuande leaned toward restraint, a choice that preserved peace but also signaled a more defensive posture compared to his father. When the emperor died in 1435, at the age of 36, his reign was remembered as a rare moment of balance in a dynasty often pulled between extremes. He had maintained northern defenses without reckless overreach, encouraged culture without neglecting administration, and kept both eunuchs and scholars within limits that prevented domination. His decade on the throne left the empire stable, prosperous, and respected. But succession again tested the dynasty. His son, the Zhengtong emperor, was only 8 years old when he inherited the throne. A child's sovereign meant regency, court intrigue, and the growing influence of eunuchs eager to shape policy. The stability of Xuande's rule would soon be tested by disaster on the steppe, when overconfidence and poor counsel led to one of the greatest humiliations in Ming history, the Tumu incident. The Tumu catastrophe had shaken the Ming dynasty to its core. For years afterward, the memory of an emperor in enemy hands haunted officials, soldiers, and commoners alike. Yet by the late 1450s, the empire had weathered the storm. The restoration of the former captive as the Tianqi emperor in 1457 marked a turning point. The dynasty had survived humiliation and civil strife, and now it sought stability. Recovery did not come quickly. The Tianqi court worked to reassert authority, punish corruption, and restore order in the bureaucracy. Ministers like Yu Qian, who had saved Beijing during the crisis, initially guided policy, but shifting factions and renewed suspicion at court meant their influence never lasted long. Even so, the dynasty was no longer in freefall. The message was clear. The Ming could survive even the gravest shock. After Tianqi's short reign, the throne passed to his son, the Chenghua emperor, who ruled for 3 decades. His long tenure provided continuity that had been missing for years. If earlier decades had been marked by usurpation and military disaster, Chenghua's reign represented a slow, steady attempt to consolidate and rebuild. The countryside became his focus. Agriculture, still recovering from devastation, was the foundation of the empire's strength. The court encouraged resettlement of abandoned lands, offered tax reductions to struggling farmers, and repaired canals vital for transporting grain from the south to Beijing. These efforts helped stabilize food supplies and reduce the risk of famine, though floods and droughts remained perennial threats. At the same time, the state attempted to balance revenues and expenditures. The treasury, drained by the costs of northern defense and earlier extravagance, needed replenishment. Taxes were enforced with greater regularity, though never without friction. Local officials often squeezed peasants harshly, and the court struggled to prevent abuse. Still, compared to the instability of the Tumu years, conditions improved. But if the countryside recovered, the palace remained a place of intrigue. The emperor, cautious by temperament, leaned heavily on eunuchs in daily governance. Their access to the sovereign gave them immense influence. They managed memorials, supervised projects, and often controlled intelligence flowing into the palace. Some acted as capable administrators, but others exploited their positions for personal gain. By the middle of the century, eunuch dominance had become a defining feature of Ming politics. The emperor's personal life also shaped his rule. He favored consort Yuan, a woman older than him, who exercised extraordinary influence in the palace. Her control over the inner court created resentment among officials and even within the imperial family. Critics claimed that she distorted the emperor's judgment, favoring her allies and suppressing rivals. Such dominance from within the harem was unusual, but not unprecedented. It reflected how personal relationships could shape imperial policy as much as formal institutions. Despite these weaknesses, the dynasty did not collapse. The Chenghua years were marked by relative peace. The Mongols remained a threat, but the frontier garrisons, reorganized after Tumu, held firm. Diplomacy alternated with skirmishes, and while no decisive victories secured permanent peace, the northern borders no longer posed an existential crisis. Internally, cultural life flourished. Porcelain production at Jingdezhen reached dazzling heights. producing wares that blended elegance with technical mastery. Blue and white ceramics, often decorated with delicate floral or narrative scenes, became prized both at home and abroad. Court painters, working under imperial patronage, created works that combined realism with symbolic grandeur. Literature, too, thrived, with scholars compiling histories and writing poetry that reflected both nostalgia for stability and anxiety over corruption. Architecture reflected the wealth of the time. Temples, palaces, and bridges rose across the realm, funded by both imperial patronage and local elites. These projects served not only practical needs but also as symbols of prosperity, returning after decades of turmoil. Still, beneath the surface, cracks remained. The growing power of eunuchs eroded the authority of civil officials, who often found themselves sidelined. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy, and reports of extortion became common. The emperor himself, though diligent at times, often withdrew into palace life, leaving state affairs in the hands of competing cliques. His reign, therefore, became a paradox. Stability and prosperity on one level, but growing structural weaknesses on another. As his 3 decades drew to a close, the Chenghua emperor left behind a mixed legacy. He had presided over recovery and cultural flowering, giving the dynasty a much-needed respite after earlier disasters. But he had also allowed eunuchs to entrench their power and corruption to spread. The Ming was stronger than in 1449, but less pure than in 1424. In 1487, his son ascended the throne as the Hongzhi emperor. Where Chenghua's reign had been steady but compromised, the new ruler would earn a reputation for honesty, order, and clarity. His era, though short, would be remembered as one of the rare golden moments in the Ming story. A calm before the storms of the 16th century, the Tumu catastrophe had shaken the Ming dynasty to its core. For years afterward, the memory of an emperor in enemy hands haunted officials, soldiers, and commoners alike. Yet by the late 1450s, the empire had weathered the storm. The restoration of the former captive as the Tianqi emperor in 1457 marked a turning point. The dynasty had survived humiliation and civil strife, and now it sought stability. Recovery did not come quickly. The Tianqi court worked to reassert authority, punish corruption, and restore order in the bureaucracy. Ministers like Yu Qian, who had saved Beijing during the crisis, initially guided policy, but shifting factions and renewed suspicion at court meant their influence never lasted long. Even so, the dynasty was no longer in freefall. The message was clear. The Ming could survive even the gravest shock. After Tianqi's short reign, the throne passed to his son, the Chenghua emperor, who ruled for 3 decades. His long tenure provided continuity that had been missing for years. If earlier decades had been marked by usurpation and military disaster, Chenghua's reign represented a slow, steady attempt to consolidate and rebuild. The countryside became his focus. Agriculture, still recovering from devastation, was the foundation of the empire's strength. The court encouraged resettlement of abandoned lands, offered tax reductions to struggling farmers, and repaired canals vital for transporting grain from the south to Beijing. These efforts helped stabilize food supplies and reduce the risk of famine, though floods and droughts remained perennial threats. At the same time, the state attempted to balance revenues and expenditures. The treasury, drained by the costs of northern defense and earlier extravagance, needed replenishment. Taxes were enforced with greater regularity, though never without friction. Local officials often squeezed peasants harshly, and the court struggled to prevent abuse. Still, compared to the instability of the Tumu years, conditions improved. But if the countryside recovered, the palace remained a place of intrigue. The emperor, cautious by temperament, leaned heavily on eunuchs in daily governance. Their access to the sovereign gave them immense influence. They managed memorials, supervised projects, and often controlled intelligence flowing into the palace. Some acted as capable administrators, but others exploited their positions for personal gain. By the middle of the century, eunuch dominance had become a defining feature of Ming politics. The emperor's personal life also shaped his rule. He favored consort Yuan, a woman older than him, who exercised extraordinary influence in the palace. Her control over the inner court created resentment among officials and even within the imperial family. Critics claimed that she distorted the emperor's judgment, favoring her allies and suppressing rivals. Such dominance from within the harem was unusual, but not unprecedented. It reflected how personal relationships could shape imperial policy as much as formal institutions. Despite these weaknesses, the dynasty did not collapse. The Chenghua years were marked by relative peace. The Mongols remained a threat, but the frontier garrisons, reorganized after Tumu, held firm. Diplomacy alternated with skirmishes, and while no decisive victories secured permanent peace, the northern borders no longer posed an existential crisis. Internally, cultural life flourished. Porcelain production at Jingdezhen reached dazzling heights, producing wares that blended elegance with technical mastery. Blue and white ceramics, often decorated with delicate floral or narrative scenes, became prized both at home and abroad. Court painters, working under imperial patronage, created works that combined realism with symbolic grandeur. Literature, too, thrived, with scholars compiling histories and writing poetry that reflected both nostalgia for stability and anxiety over corruption. Architecture reflected the wealth of the time. Temples, palaces, and bridges rose across the realm, funded by both imperial patronage and local elites. These projects served not only practical needs but also as symbols of prosperity, returning after decades of turmoil. Still, beneath the surface, cracks remained. The growing power of eunuchs eroded the authority of civil officials, who often found themselves sidelined. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy, and reports of extortion became common. The emperor himself, though diligent at times, often withdrew into palace life, leaving state affairs in the hands of competing cliques. His reign, therefore, became a paradox. Stability and prosperity on one level, but growing structural weaknesses on another. As his 3 decades drew to a close, the Chenghua emperor left behind a mixed legacy. He had presided over recovery and cultural flowering, giving the dynasty a much-needed respite after earlier disasters. But he had also allowed eunuchs to entrench their power and corruption to spread. The Ming was stronger than in 1449, but less pure than in 1424. In 1487, his son ascended the throne as the Hongzhi emperor. Where Chenghua's reign had been steady but compromised, the new ruler would earn a reputation for honesty, order, and clarity. His era, though short, would be remembered as one of the rare golden moments in the Ming story. A calm before the storms of the 16th century, the Tumu catastrophe had shaken the Ming dynasty to its core. For years afterward, the memory of an emperor in enemy hands haunted officials, soldiers, and commoners alike. Yet by the late 1450s, the empire had weathered the storm. The restoration of the former captive as the Tianqi emperor in 1457 marked a turning point. The dynasty had survived humiliation and civil strife, and now it sought stability. recovery did not come quickly. The Tianqi court worked to reassert authority, punish corruption, and restore order in the bureaucracy. Ministers like Yu Qian, who had saved Beijing during the crisis, initially guided policy, but shifting factions and renewed suspicion at court meant their influence never lasted long. Even so, the dynasty was no longer in freefall. The message was clear. The Ming could survive even the gravest shock. After Tianshun's short reign, the throne passed to his son, the Chenghua emperor, who ruled for 3 decades. His long tenure provided continuity that had been missing for years. If earlier decades had been marked by usurpation and military disaster, Chenghua's reign represented a slow, steady attempt to consolidate and rebuild. The countryside became his focus. Agriculture, still recovering from devastation, was the foundation of the empire's strength. The court encouraged resettlement of abandoned lands, offered tax reductions to struggling farmers, and repaired canals vital for transporting grain from the south to Beijing. These efforts helped stabilize food supplies and reduce the risk of famine, though floods and droughts remained perennial threats. At the same time, the state attempted to balance revenues and expenditures. The treasury, drained by the costs of northern defense and earlier extravagance, needed replenishment. Taxes were enforced with greater regularity, though never without friction. Local officials often squeezed peasants harshly, and the court struggled to prevent abuse. Still, compared to the instability of the Tumu years, conditions improved. But if the countryside recovered, the palace remained a place of intrigue. The emperor, cautious by temperament, leaned heavily on eunuchs in daily governance. Their access to the sovereign gave them immense influence. They managed memorials, supervised projects, and often controlled intelligence flowing into the palace. Some acted as capable administrators, but others exploited their positions for personal gain. By the middle of the century, eunuch dominance had become a defining feature of Ming politics. The emperor's personal life also shaped his rule. He favored consort Yuan, a woman older than him, who exercised extraordinary influence in the palace. Her control over the inner court created resentment among officials and even within the imperial family. Critics claimed that she distorted the emperor's judgment, favoring her allies and suppressing rivals. Such dominance from within the harem was unusual, but not unprecedented. It reflected how personal relationships could shape imperial policy as much as formal institutions. Despite these weaknesses, the dynasty did not collapse. The Chenghua years were marked by relative peace. The Mongols remained a threat, but the frontier garrisons, reorganized after Tumu, held firm. Diplomacy alternated with skirmishes, and while no decisive victories secured permanent peace, the northern borders no longer posed an existential crisis. Internally, cultural life flourished. Porcelain production at Jingdezhen reached dazzling heights, producing wares that blended elegance with technical mastery. Blue and white ceramics, often decorated with delicate floral or narrative scenes, became prized both at home and abroad. Court painters, working under imperial patronage, created works that combined realism with symbolic grandeur. Literature, too, thrived, with scholars compiling histories and writing poetry that reflected both nostalgia for stability and anxiety over corruption. Architecture reflected the wealth of the time. Temples, palaces, and bridges rose across the realm, funded by both imperial patronage and local elites. These projects served not only practical needs but also as symbols of prosperity, returning after decades of turmoil. Still, beneath the surface, cracks remained. The growing power of eunuchs eroded the authority of civil officials, who often found themselves sidelined. Corruption spread through the bureaucracy, and reports of extortion became common. The emperor himself, though diligent at times, often withdrew into palace life, leaving state affairs in the hands of competing cliques. His reign, therefore, became a paradox: stability and prosperity on one level, but growing structural weaknesses on another. As his 3 decades drew to a close, the Chenghua emperor left behind a mixed legacy. He had presided over recovery and cultural flowering, giving the dynasty a much-needed respite after earlier disasters. But he had also allowed eunuchs to entrench their power and corruption to spread. The Ming was stronger than in 1449, but less pure than in 1424. In 1487, his son ascended the throne as the Hongzhi emperor. Where Chenghua's reign had been steady but compromised, the new ruler would earn a reputation for honesty, order, and clarity. His era, though short, would be remembered as one of the rare golden moments in the Ming story. A calm before the storms of the 16th century, when the Zhengde emperor died suddenly in 1521. Officials expected turbulence to subside. Instead, the throne passed to his cousin, Zhu Hochong, a provincial prince who had grown up far from the capital. Still a teenager, he arrived in Beijing to inherit a realm already weakened by indulgence and corruption. Known as the Jiajing emperor, he would rule for 45 years, longer than any of his predecessors. Yet his longevity proved no blessing. His reign was marked by suspicion of ministers, withdrawal from government, and a consuming obsession with Daoist immortality. The first years revealed both his determination and his temperament. Because he was not the direct son of his predecessor, ritual practice required him to honor Zhengde's father as his own in the imperial ancestral cult. He refused. He insisted on continuing to honor his biological parent, a minor prince, rather than adopt another lineage. This dispute, remembered as the Great Rights Controversy, convulsed the court. Ministers, steeped in Confucian orthodoxy, pressed him to yield. The young emperor met their resistance with fury. Dozens of officials were dismissed, flogged, or executed for their persistence. The outcome confirmed his authority, but poisoned his relationship with the bureaucracy. From that point forward, he viewed many scholar officials not as servants of the state, but as arrogant adversaries. Once established on the throne, he increasingly withdrew from the routines of governance. Unlike earlier rulers who held daily audiences and read reports with diligence, Jiajing came to resent the constant admonitions of his ministers. Over time, he simply stopped meeting them. For long stretches, he refused to appear in public ceremonies at all. Memorials went unanswered, and decisions piled up. Officials who tried to press him to engage often found themselves punished. In their absence, eunuchs filled the void. Palace servants who controlled access to the sovereign became the gatekeepers of power. They determined which petitions reached his eyes, which careers advanced, and which provinces received attention. Offices were sold, bribes flowed, and corruption flourished in ways that honest ministers could neither stop nor expose. As the ruler distanced himself from politics, he turned inward to religious pursuits. Daoist priests promised him methods to prolong life, and perhaps even attain immortality. He embraced their teachings with zeal. Temples were constructed at vast expense, rituals performed with great pomp, and expeditions dispatched to gather rare herbs and minerals for alchemical preparations. He consumed strange elixirs in the hope of refining his essence, despite warnings that such substances could be dangerous. He also drafted young women into the palace for esoteric rites meant to strengthen his vitality. Confucian officials regarded these practices as immoral and wasteful, but their objections carried little weight. the emperor's attention remained fixed on the promise of transcending death, while the practical affairs of empire languished. Neglect at the center coincided with growing threats on the frontiers. In the north, Mongol power revived under Altan Khan, whose cavalry pressed deep into Ming territory. Raids struck the provinces near Beijing, and in 1550, the capital itself faced imminent danger as smoke from burning villages rose within sight of the walls. Panic gripped the court, and only desperate defenses combined with hurried negotiations prevented catastrophe. The spectacle of nomadic horsemen threatening the heart of the empire revealed how far military readiness had eroded under an absentee ruler. Even more serious was the crisis along the coasts. Japanese pirates, known as wokou, had raided Chinese shores for centuries. But in this era, the threat escalated dramatically. These raiders were not only Japanese adventurers, but also Chinese smugglers and discontented soldiers, exploiting the bans on maritime trade to profit from illicit commerce. They struck towns, seized goods, and carried away captives, terrorizing entire provinces. The situation worsened when Portuguese traders entered East Asian waters. Their firearms and ships gave the raiders new advantages, and local officials often lacked the resources or discipline to resist. For years, coastal communities lived under siege, their livelihoods disrupted, their confidence in the dynasty shaken. Eventually, the state responded. Commanders such as Wang Zhe restructured defenses, drilling troops in the use of firearms and fortifying harbors. These reforms gradually stemmed the tide, but not before decades of devastation. The wokou crisis left scars across the southeast and highlighted the dangers of a ruler who turned his back on the responsibilities of defense. Where local initiative and determined commanders prevailed, peace returned. Where central neglect persisted, corruption and chaos remained entrenched. While violence marked the seas, foreign contact also brought new influences. Jesuit missionaries arrived, among them Matteo Ricci, carrying with them knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and cartography. At first, they appeared as curiosities, foreigners with strange instruments and teachings. Slowly, they introduced Western scientific methods, impressing some officials even as their Christian doctrines met suspicion. Their presence did not yet reshape policy, but their arrival signaled the beginning of exchanges that would eventually leave deep marks on Ming intellectual life. Despite disorder at the top, commerce continued to expand. Silver from abroad entered China in increasing quantities, carried across oceans by Spanish galleons from the Americas, and funneled through Manila into Asian markets. Taxes began to rely more heavily on silver payments, integrating the empire into global trade. Merchants in southern ports grew wealthy, and regional markets flourished, while peasants often struggled under the pressure of monetized obligations. The contrast between thriving commercial centers and overburdened rural households revealed widening social divides. Through it all, the emperor remained remote, a figure glimpsed only rarely. His seclusion became legendary. Ministers described him as a ghost within his own palace, more devoted to alchemists than to officials, more engaged with celestial rituals than earthly matters. His reign endured not because of his presence, but despite his absence, sustained by the inertia of institutions and the resilience of local society. When he died in 1567, his body gave out despite decades spent seeking immortality. His half-century on the throne left behind a dynasty still intact but strained. Eunuchs had entrenched themselves deeply in administration. Corruption had spread widely, and confidence in the monarchy was weakened. Yet the dynasty endured, ready to pass to a new generation. The Wanli emperor, who would follow in the next reign, would inherit not only the throne, but also the burden of a state shaped by decades of neglect. His time would begin with reform, but end in paralysis, continuing the cycle of ambition and collapse that defined the Ming. The death of the Longqing emperor in the early 1570s placed the dynasty in a fragile position once more. He had only reigned for a few years, attempting modest reforms after decades of Jiajing's neglect. His sudden passing left the throne to his 9-year-old son, Zhu Yijun, who would reign as the Wanli emperor. For ministers and generals, the sight of a child on the throne raised fears that court factions, eunuchs, and greedy officials would dominate the realm. Instead, the first decade of his reign produced one of the most remarkable recoveries in Ming history, thanks to the guiding hand of Grand Secretary Zhang Juzheng. The young emperor owed his survival as a ruler to this formidable statesman. Zhang had already built a reputation as an intelligent and pragmatic official. With the backing of the Empress Dowager, he assumed control of the government, shielding the boy's sovereign from factional struggles. He insisted that the child emperor devote himself to study and discipline while leaving the burdens of governance in his mentor's capable hands. In effect, China was ruled not by the Wanli emperor, but by Zhang Juzheng, who transformed a vulnerable regency into a decade of reform. Zhang began by tightening discipline across the bureaucracy. For too long, officials had treated attendance at court as optional. Memorials were neglected, and corruption had flourished under indulgent monarchs. He issued strict orders. Absences without cause would be punished. Reports must be submitted promptly, and dishonest practices would be exposed. To reinforce his authority, he made examples of negligent officials, dismissing or punishing them regardless of rank. This created resentment, but it also restored fear of the law. The bureaucracy, long accustomed to laxity, rediscovered a sense of order. Even in distant provinces, magistrates understood that their conduct might reach the eyes of the all-powerful Grand Secretary. Reform extended into the fiscal system. For centuries, wealthy families had concealed landholdings, avoiding taxes and shifting burdens onto poorer peasants. Zhang ordered comprehensive surveys to uncover hidden estates. Teams of inspectors measured fields, compared records, and forced landlords to register property honestly. This enraged the gentry, who had long enjoyed privilege, but it dramatically increased state revenue. At the same time, he sought to protect small farmers by standardizing assessments, reducing opportunities for local officials to extort beyond what was due. The policy did not end exploitation, but it curbed the worst abuses and gave peasants greater predictability in their obligations. The boldest innovation was the so-called single whip method. Previously, taxation was a confusing mixture of grain deliveries, corvée labor, and miscellaneous fees. Zhang commuted these obligations into a single silver payment. This simplified administration for the state and clarified obligations for subjects. It also linked the Chinese economy more directly to global silver flows, as Spanish galleons carried bullion from the Americas to Manila, and Portuguese traders funneled it into East Asia. The Ming benefited from a steady inflow of silver. Farmers could sell part of their crop for coin. Merchants could expand trade, and the government could collect revenues more efficiently. The impact was transformative. Markets expanded across the empire, towns grew more prosperous, and merchant families gained new prominence. Artisans found steady demand for their goods, from textiles to ceramics. Soldiers on the frontier, often unpaid in earlier decades, now received more regular stipends. The treasury, replenished after years of strain, could fund defenses, public works, and relief for disaster-stricken regions. Though Zhang's methods were harsh, they delivered results visible to both elites and commoners. Not everyone welcomed these changes. Scholar officials resented the Grand Secretary's dominance, which left little room for debate. Many complained that his enforcement of discipline was tyrannical, more befitting a despot than a Confucian administrator. Some accused him of hypocrisy, pointing to his own family's wealth and the luxurious lifestyle he maintained. But their criticisms carried little force, so long as the boy emperor and his grandmother supported him. For Wanli himself, Zhang was not only a political guardian, but a tutor, instilling habits of diligence and respect for authority in his early years. Military affairs also benefited. With reliable funding, frontier garrisons were supplied and fortifications repaired. Commanders who had once begged for resources could now maintain readiness. Raids from Mongol confederations continued, but the dynasty no longer seemed paralyzed in the face of threats. In the south, improved revenues allowed local officials to strengthen coastal defenses, preventing a repeat of the devastation wrought by pirates in the previous reign. For once, the empire's defenses matched its ambitions. The results impressed contemporaries. Tribute missions flowed steadily to Beijing. Envoys marveled at the restored dignity of the court, and foreign observers noted China's revived prosperity. For many, it seemed that the dynasty had overcome the stagnation of the mid-16th century. Scholars, merchants, and peasants alike benefited from the new order, even if some gentry bristled under stricter taxation. But the strength of this system rested heavily on one man. Zhang Zhuzheng's authority was personal as much as institutional. He bound the court together through force of will, balancing factions, punishing rivals, and rewarding loyalists. His harshness created enemies who bided their time, waiting for the day when his power would falter. That moment came in 1582, when Zhang died. Almost immediately, pent-up resentment exploded. Officials who had suffered under his discipline launched investigations into his family. Accusations of corruption multiplied. His estates were confiscated and his household disgraced. Many of his policies remained in place, but the spirit of rigorous enforcement collapsed. The bureaucracy, no longer under his watchful eye, slid back into factionalism. For the Wanli emperor, now entering adulthood, Zhang's death marked a turning point. Freed from his mentor's discipline, he began to assert his independence. At first, he seemed determined to rule in the spirit of his guardian, but soon, his frustration with the endless disputes of officials soured his enthusiasm. Without Zhang's iron hand, the unity of the early reign dissolved. Even so, the decade of reform left a profound legacy. The single whip method endured, shaping the economy for generations. The integration of China into global silver flows accelerated, binding the dynasty to a new international order. The discipline Zhang had imposed lingered in memory, even as officials quietly returned to old habits. His enemies destroyed his reputation, but history later recognized him as one of the most effective reformers in Ming history. The young Wanli emperor inherited both the benefits and the burdens of Zhang's rule. He enjoyed a strong treasury and a revitalized state, but he also faced a bureaucracy resentful of discipline and eager to reclaim privilege. In the years ahead, his own choices would determine whether the gains of the 1570s could be sustained. Soon, a crisis of unprecedented scale would test the Ming's strength. The Japanese invasions of Korea, a war so costly that it would undo much of Zhang's careful fiscal rebuilding. The Ming dynasty entered the last years of the 16th century, battered by triumph and exhaustion. The wars in Korea had ended in victory, but at staggering cost. Soldiers had marched, fleets had sailed, and mountains of silver had been poured into the struggle. Japan's retreat from the peninsula did not restore the Ming to security. Instead, it left behind an empire drained of treasure and racked by fatigue. It was at this moment, with the dynasty poised between glory and ruin, that the Wanli emperor began to turn away from government. His early reign under Juzheng had shown promise. Revenues were stable, discipline enforced, and the empire projected power with confidence. Yet once his mentor was gone, the young ruler discovered the daily burdens of office without the rewards of harmony. He was confronted constantly with squabbling officials, each faction seeking advantage, each memorial filled with recriminations. The endless disputes wore down his patience. Over time, he chose a radical solution. He simply stopped participating. The emperor's withdrawal was gradual but unmistakable. At first, he reduced audiences, then ceased holding them altogether. For years on end, he refused to appear in court, leaving memorials unanswered. Requests for appointments, promotions, or policy decisions piled up. Ministers were forced to argue among themselves, often without resolution. The empire continued to function in a mechanical sense, but without the decisive presence of its monarch. Authority drifted, and what had once been the heart of the system fell silent. This silence bred corruption. Eunuchs who controlled palace gates exploited their access, selling influence and blocking petitions. Factions among civil officials hardened, each accusing the other of betraying Confucian principle. Scholar officials of the Donglin Academy, a movement founded in Jiangnan, emerged as critics of corruption and defenders of moral governance. They called for honesty, discipline, and a return to the ideals of earlier dynasties. At first, they were admired for their integrity, but their activism deepened the divide within the bureaucracy. The Donglin reformers clashed with more pragmatic or self-serving officials, creating constant paralysis. Without an emperor to adjudicate, disputes festered endlessly. While the court fought over ritual and principle, disasters mounted outside the palace walls. The climate turned harsher during what historians now call the Little Ice Age. Summers grew shorter, winters longer, and harvests failed with alarming frequency. Floods inundated farmlands along the Yellow River, while droughts withered crops in the north. Peasants who could no longer pay taxes fled their villages, becoming vagrants or joining bandit bands. Local uprisings broke out, suppressed only with difficulty. The promise of stability from Zhang Juzheng's reforms dissolved as nature conspired with neglect to deepen misery. Economic strains compounded the problem. The single whip method had bound taxes to silver payments, and for decades the system had worked because global silver flowed steadily into China. But by the late 16th century, disruptions in trade began to cause shortages. The flow from the Americas faltered, prices fluctuated wildly, and ordinary households struggled to find enough silver to meet obligations. Farmers sold land to pay taxes, merchants hoarded coin, and regional economies seized up. A system once hailed as efficient became a trap, magnifying hardship during scarcity. The emperor remained detached. He lived within the palace, indulging in private pleasures, surrounding himself with favored consorts and children, and refusing to be drawn into the disputes of his ministers. He justified his withdrawal by claiming that officials should govern themselves through Confucian principle. But in practice, it meant that no one could resolve disputes. Civil administration drifted into paralysis, each faction blaming the other for failures that mounted in the provinces. Foreign threats grew more dangerous at the same time. To the northeast, a new power was rising among the Yuan tribes. Under the leadership of Nurhaci, they were united into a formidable confederation, organized through the innovative Eight Banners system that combined military and social control. Nurhaci's forces adapted Chinese firearms and siege tactics, turning from scattered tribes into a disciplined state. Step by step, they pushed against Ming outposts in Liaodong, probing weaknesses along the frontier. What began as a distant nuisance evolved into an existential threat, though at the time, few in Beijing grasped its full significance. The combination of domestic paralysis, environmental crisis, fiscal strain, and foreign danger created a perfect storm. Provinces begged for resources to relieve famine or repel raiders, but the central government could not act swiftly. Scholar officials debated moral principle, while granaries stood empty. Eunuchs enriched themselves while armies on the frontier went unpaid. The once mighty Ming, which had sent fleets across the oceans and armies across Korea, seemed unable to organize even the simplest relief. Among common people, despair grew. Villages struck by famine turned to rebellion, sometimes under religious banners, sometimes out of sheer hunger. Bandit leaders rose, claiming heavenly visions or promising justice, attracting thousands of desperate followers. The court responded with repression, but the underlying causes, climate change, tax burdens, and official corruption, remained. Each year the sense deepened that the dynasty no longer cared for its subjects. For the emperor himself, years of seclusion turned into decades. Officials pleaded with him to return to public life, but he ignored them. Succession disputes within the palace consumed his limited attention. He quarreled with ministers over which of his sons should be designated heir, refusing to yield even as the question paralyzed court business. His refusal to appear in court became legendary, symbolizing the breakdown of the dynasty's central authority. By the time Wanli died in 1620, the empire he left behind was hollowed out. On paper, the Ming remained powerful, with vast lands, wealthy cities, and a long tradition of cultural prestige. In reality, its treasury was strained, its bureaucracy divided, its peasants restless, and its frontiers under threat. The emperor's long withdrawal had eroded confidence in the throne itself. His successors would inherit not a stable realm, but a fragile shell, easily shaken by storms to come. The death of a ruler who had turned his back on governance did not mark the start of renewal. Instead, it marked the point at which neglect hardened into crisis. Ahead lay an age of eunuch tyranny, mounting Manchu aggression, and peasant uprisings that would bring the dynasty to its knees. When the young Zhu Yujiao ascended the throne in 1620, hope flickered briefly among officials who had endured Wanli's decades of silence. Perhaps a new sovereign, even though still a boy, might restore vitality to the court. Instead, they soon discovered that the new ruler cared little for governance. Known as the Tianqi emperor, he was fascinated not by statecraft, but by carpentry. He spent hours in workshops within the palace, building furniture, carving wooden toys, and designing mechanical contraptions. Ministers who tried to discuss policy found his attention drifting back to his tools. The business of empire became, once again, someone else's responsibility. Into this vacuum stepped Wei Zhongxian, a eunuch whose name would become synonymous with corruption and tyranny. Rising from obscurity through palace connections, he ingratiated himself with the emperor's wet nurse, Madame K, and from there gained influence over the throne itself. With Tianqi distracted by his hobbies, Wei moved quickly to consolidate power. He placed loyal eunuchs in key posts, manipulated the flow of information, and ensured that appointments went to his supporters. Within a few years, He dominated the government more completely than any eunuch before him. Wei's rule was marked by ruthless purges. He targeted the Donglin Academy faction, those scholar officials who had long denounced corruption and called for moral government. Accusing them of treason and disloyalty, he had their leaders arrested, tortured, and executed. Entire families were destroyed, reputations blackened, and careers ruined. The purges spread fear through the bureaucracy. Officials learned that survival depended not on competence or integrity, but on loyalty to the eunuch regime. Many chose silence, unwilling to risk their lives by speaking out. Corruption reached new heights. Offices were openly sold, military commands traded for bribes, and tax revenues siphoned into private coffers. Wei Zhongxian built temples in his honor, with inscriptions hailing him as a living sage. His image appeared in schools and shrines, treated almost as that of an emperor. For common people, already suffering under famine and heavy taxes, the spectacle of a eunuch worshipped while officials starved peasants for silver confirmed that the dynasty had lost its moral compass. Inside the palace, Madame K reinforced Wei's dominance. As the emperor's nurse and confidant, she controlled access to the young sovereign and ensured that carpentry, not politics, remained his focus. Together, Wei and Madame K formed a regime that ruled in the emperor's name, but for their own enrichment. The Son of Heaven became a passive figure, remembered by courtiers more for his crafted wooden toys than for any decree. While the court rotted from within, the frontiers faced growing peril. In the northeast, Nurhaci completed the unification of the Yuan tribes, forging them into a new state soon to be known as the Manchus. His 8 banners system organized warriors and families alike, combining military strength with social cohesion. Ming commanders underestimated the danger, but defeat soon proved the seriousness of the threat. At the Battle of Sarhu in 1619, Ming armies suffered a crushing loss against Nurhaci's forces. The frontier defenses in Liaodong weakened steadily, leaving Beijing increasingly exposed. The regime in the capital, preoccupied with internal purges and personal enrichment, offered little effective response. Funds that might have gone to fortifications or supplies were diverted to Wei's household or wasted on palace luxuries. Soldiers on the frontier went unpaid. Desertions increased and morale collapsed. Provincial governors begged for reinforcements, but the court provided little more than empty proclamations. The dynasty was sliding toward disaster, yet those in power seemed blind to it. At the same time, ordinary people endured worsening hardship. The colder climate of the Little Ice Age continued to shorten harvests, while floods and droughts struck with grim regularity. Tax collectors, under pressure to meet quotas, extracted payments even from villages devastated by disaster. Some peasants abandoned their fields, joining roaming bands of the desperate. Others turned to rebellion, attacking granaries or refusing to pay taxes altogether. Local unrest spread, signaling a society under mounting strain. For a brief moment, officials outside Wei Zhongxian's circle tried to rally resistance. Some denounced his corruption, others attempted to revive the principles of the Donglin Academy. But the eunuch's control of palace guards and his manipulation of imperial decrees silenced opposition. Those who spoke too loudly met exile or execution. By the mid-1620s, Wei seemed unassailable, the real master of the empire, while the emperor carved wooden toys in his workshops. The Ming dynasty now faced crisis on every front. Corruption at the heart of government, unrest among the people, and a rising power in the north. Authority that had once radiated from the throne had collapsed inward, captured by a eunuch who ruled through fear. The dynasty survived these years not because of its institutions, but because inertia carried it forward. Yet the cost was profound. Trust in the court evaporated, armies lost confidence, and ordinary subjects felt abandoned. By the time the Tianqi emperor died in 1627, still a young man, the Ming state was hollowed out. His death ended Wei Zhongxian's tyranny, as rivals swiftly moved to purge him and erase his honors. But the damage had already been done. The empire entered the next reign, with institutions crippled, corruption entrenched, and foreign enemies gathering strength beyond the passes. The Ming had not yet fallen, but its collapse had become a question of when, not if. The Ming dynasty entered the late 1620s in turmoil. Eunuchs had dominated the court. The treasury was nearly empty, and rebellions spread across the countryside. Foreign enemies pressed at the borders, and confidence in the throne was shattered. Against this backdrop, a new ruler emerged who seemed determined to restore order. Zhu Yujian, remembered as the Chongzhen emperor, was young, serious, and relentless in his sense of duty. He vowed to cleanse the dynasty of corruption and to resist its enemies, no matter the odds. For officials weary of misrule, his arrival felt like a final chance to save the empire. His first moves carried a sense of justice long denied. The eunuch Wei Zhongxian, who had terrorized the bureaucracy under the Tianqi emperor, was stripped of power. Temples built in his honor were torn down, his supporters purged, and the man himself driven to suicide. To many, this was proof that the new sovereign meant what he said. The days of eunuch tyranny were over. But rooting out a single tyrant could not repair decades of rot. The court still seethed with rival factions, and the treasury remained drained from years of neglect and corruption. External threats grew sharper at the same time. Nurhaci's death had not ended the rise of the Jurchens. His son Hongzhi forged them into a new nation, calling itself the Manchus. The Eight Banners system, which organized entire communities into military and social units, produced disciplined armies able to combine cavalry with firearms and siege tactics. Their alliances with Mongol tribes encircled Ming territory, and their victories at battles such as Sarhu exposed the weakness of imperial defenses. Step by step, they advanced toward the passes that guarded Beijing itself. Meanwhile, misery at home boiled into revolt. The colder climate of the Little Ice Age shortened harvests, and a cycle of floods and droughts left peasants desperate. Taxes tied to silver under the single whip method became unbearable when shortages of bullion struck. Families sold land, abandoned villages, or fled into the mountains. Rebellion offered not only food, but also a sense of justice against officials seen as predators rather than protectors. Among dozens of leaders, Li Zicheng rose to prominence, transforming hunger-driven mobs into a disciplined force that marched under banners promising relief and fairness. The emperor threw himself into the crisis with unrelenting energy. He worked long hours, read memorials, and demanded that generals and ministers do their duty. He dismissed corrupt officials and promoted those he believed loyal. But his resources were hopelessly inadequate. The treasury could not meet the costs of war and famine relief. Soldiers often went unpaid, deserting to the rebels or selling their arms to survive. Garrisons along the frontier melted away, and commanders abandoned posts rather than fight with empty hands. Factionalism inside the bureaucracy only worsened matters. The Donglin scholars, long celebrated for their integrity, returned to prominence but proved rigid and moralistic. They denounced corruption fiercely, but they also quarreled endlessly with rivals, demanding purges that paralyzed the court. Chongzhen's own temperament compounded the problem. Determined to root out failure, he dismissed officials at the first sign of weakness, sometimes executing generals who lost battles. Instead of inspiring confidence, this bred fear. Men hesitated to take initiative, knowing that even loyalty might be rewarded with suspicion if results disappointed. On the frontiers, defeats piled up. Manchu armies exploited Ming weaknesses, raiding across the Great Wall and capturing key fortresses. Their mastery of firearms and cavalry made them formidable, and each campaign revealed the decay of Ming defenses. At the same time, rebel movements in the interior swelled. Li Zicheng's army captured city after city, feeding the hungry and punishing corrupt landlords. He built legitimacy, not only through force, but through the image of justice, drawing recruits from soldiers and peasants alike. The emperor's determination never wavered, but determination was not enough. Each year brought worse news: famine spreading through the provinces, plague killing thousands, provinces refusing to remit taxes. Local officials begged for silver that no longer existed. Caravans of supplies never arrived. The dynasty's vast territory, once its strength, became a burden too great to carry with a hollow treasury. By the early 1640s, collapse was unmistakable. Rebel forces controlled much of the central plains. Manchu armies waited at the frontier, and Beijing itself was ringed by desperation. The emperor ordered desperate levies, new taxes, and prayers to heaven, but none reversed the tide. His court, fractured and exhausted, whispered of flight. Yet he refused to abandon the capital. In the spring of 1644, Li Zicheng's forces reached Beijing. Defenses that had once been formidable stood undermanned, and morale collapsed. As rebel banners appeared outside the walls, panic swept the city. Inside the palace, Chongzhen recognized that the dynasty he had tried so hard to save was finished. He did not flee, nor did he seek surrender. Instead, he walked alone to Coal Hill behind the Forbidden City. There, beneath a tree, he hanged himself, leaving a final note of apology to his ancestors. His body, still clad in imperial robes, was discovered by loyal attendants, a tragic symbol of loyalty and failure. The fall of Beijing did not erase Ming resistance. Loyalist courts would rise in the south, clinging to fragments of authority. Yet the suicide of the last Ming emperor in the northern capital marked the end of the dynasty as a unified power. It was not a single battle that destroyed it, but decades of neglect, corruption, environmental disaster, and relentless enemies. Chongzhen's struggles embodied both the dynasty's desperate will to survive and its inability to overcome the forces that surrounded it. The spring of 1644 brought the unthinkable. Rebel forces under Li Zicheng, once dismissed as little more than starving peasants, entered Beijing. The Chongzhen emperor was dead, his body hanging on Coal Hill, and the dynasty that had ruled for nearly 3 centuries seemed to have ended overnight. Yet the fall of the capital was not the end of the Ming story. Instead, it opened a chaotic struggle among rebels, loyalists, and foreign conquerors, each claiming the mandate of heaven in a land torn by war. Li Zicheng proclaimed the establishment of a new regime, the Shun dynasty. At first, his triumph appeared complete. He controlled the imperial city, the court rituals, and the symbols of legitimacy. His armies had swept aside garrisons and captured vast territories in the north. But victory brought challenges his movement was ill-prepared to meet. Peasant bands, hardened by years of raiding, lacked the discipline to govern. In the capital, looting spread, alienating the city's residents. Scholars and officials, already wary of a man who rose from rebellion, found little reason to pledge loyalty. The legitimacy he craved slipped away as quickly as it had been claimed. Meanwhile, beyond the Great Wall, another power prepared to strike. The Manchus, unified under Hongzhi and his successors, had long waited for such a moment. For decades, they had chipped away at Ming defenses, forging alliances and building strength. Now, with Beijing in chaos, the frontier lay open. Ming General Wu Sangui, stationed at the crucial Shanhai Pass, faced a choice. Li Zicheng demanded his submission, while the Manchus promised aid. Torn between loyalty to a fallen dynasty and fear of rebel domination, Wu opened the gates to the Manchu banners. Together, they marched on Beijing. The clash was swift. Li Zicheng's armies, unprepared for disciplined opposition, collapsed under the combined assault. Within months of seizing the capital, he was driven out. His Shun dynasty reduced to flight and eventual defeat. The Manchus entered Beijing, claiming at first to avenge the fallen Ming. Soon, however, it became clear that they had come not as allies, but as conquerors. By 1644, the Qing dynasty was proclaimed, and the rule of the Manchus began. Yet the Ming had not entirely vanished. South of the Yangtze, princes of the imperial family declared themselves heirs to the throne. These southern Ming courts rose in Nanjing, Fujian, and Guangdong, each rallying loyalists who refused to accept foreign conquest. Scholars, generals, and common people alike clung to the hope that the dynasty could be restored. For nearly 40 years, fragments of Ming authority flickered across southern China. The southern Ming faced immense challenges. Rival princes quarreled over legitimacy, each claiming the right to the throne. Resources were scarce and armies often undisciplined, yet loyalist generals carried on the struggle. Zheng Chenggong, known in the west as Koxinga, led resistance from the southeast, harassing Qing forces and sustaining a naval base that later established power in Taiwan. His fleet became a symbol of defiance, projecting Ming loyalty even after the dynasty's heartland was lost. In the interior, resistance took other forms. Some officials committed suicide rather than serve the new dynasty. Others shaved their heads in mourning, refusing the Manchu order to adopt the Q hairstyle, which symbolized submission. Families preserved Ming regalia and records as sacred relics. Scholars debated whether heaven's mandate had truly shifted, or whether the dynasty might yet return. Loyalty to the Ming became as much a moral stance as a political reality. For the Manchus, conquest was gradual and bloody. Armies pushed south over decades, crushing resistance city by city. Some Ming generals, weary of hopeless war, surrendered and served the Qing. Others fought to the death. The struggle left towns burned, populations displaced, and millions dead. By the 1660s, organized Ming resistance had been broken, but memory of the fallen dynasty lingered as a source of cultural pride and nostalgia. The trauma of the fall reshaped Chinese thought. For many, the Ming represented the last era of native Han rule before foreign domination returned. Scholars debated whether corruption and neglect had doomed the dynasty, or whether heaven's will had simply shifted. Plays, poems, and histories memorialized loyal officials and generals who had resisted. Stories of martyrs who chose death over submission circulated widely, creating a pantheon of heroes remembered for centuries. The legacy of the Ming was complex. On one hand, its fall revealed the dangers of neglect, factionalism, and corruption. On the other, its achievements in culture, commerce, and statecraft left deep marks on China. The Forbidden City, the Great Wall fortifications, and the porcelain of Jingdezhen remained enduring symbols of its glory. Even under Qing rule, Ming styles in painting, literature, and philosophy continued to shape Chinese culture. In southern China and overseas, memory of the dynasty became a rallying point. Communities in Taiwan, Southeast Asia, and beyond preserved loyalty to the Ming as part of their identity. Koxinga's descendants in Taiwan upheld the banner of resistance for decades, blending Ming loyalty with maritime ambition. To many, the dynasty had ended in politics, but survived in spirit. Looking back, the Ming story seemed almost inevitable. A dynasty born from peasant rebellion under Hongwu, expanded to global horizons under Yongle, stabilized under Xuande, then undermined by corruption, environmental crisis, and foreign threat. Each reign added layers of strength and weakness until, by the 17th century, the structure could no longer bear its weight. The fall in 1644 was sudden, but the decay that led to it had taken generations. And yet, the dynasty's memory did not fade. For later Chinese, the Ming stood as a symbol of native sovereignty, of resistance against foreign domination, and of cultural pride. Its failures became cautionary lessons, its achievements enduring legacies. Even today, the Ming remains one of the most vivid dynasties in Chinese memory, remembered not only for how it rose and fell, but for the way it embodied both the glory and the tragedy of empire.